right. So it's early September 2021, and we just got a great sign of where things are going in China. Earlier this month, the Beijing government decided and just announced that it was going to create a Beijing stock exchange. So this would be a new market to exchange securities, and it would be located in Beijing, as the name obviously suggests. But this is something way more interesting than the media is really grabbing or taking hold of. It's pretty remarkable. But Beijing is trying to sell this as a positive, as a sort of a net benefit for technological innovation and economic growth in China. And that is totally off base. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So this is hopefully a pretty quick episode. It could be a little longer though, we'll see. But basically we're going to talk about what China's trying to do, how it's trying to centralize wealth and power in China, how there's a bit of a north-south dynamic, little dilemma that's going to emerge as part of this, how part of the Chinese economic model is clearly on the rocks if this is what we're seeing as the policy Beijing is trying to throw out to fix what's wrong. And yeah, that broken model we'll get into a little bit more. And then we'll just conclude and talk about really what we should take from this and what it means for people who are evaluating China, trying to figure out where the whole world is going, if that's what we're going to see there. Okay, so yeah, first, this is a move to centralize power, and particularly centralize, unify wealth and power in more of northern China. So Beijing is trying to centralize economic power on its northern capital, which also happens to be the capital in Beijing. And this is part of a very, 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 very old game in China. Historically, northern China couldn't really sustain itself or develop itself using its own resources. It actually needed foreign capital or external capital to develop the large North China plain that is the core of northern China. So it needed, actually, it wasn't places in other parts of the world. It wasn't like it took capital from Africa or anything. It actually took the money and the resources from other parts of China. And in particular, this meant the Yangtze. So basically, other parts of China were used to feed the beast. And a lot of what that meant was draining capital out of the Yangtze region, and particularly the Yangtze River Delta region, which is currently centered on Shanghai, but in the past it was more a different city called Nanjing. And, well, this is a really important point here. Beijing, basically in Chinese, it means northern capital. Nanjing in Chinese means southern capital. So we're getting a clue as to what's going on here. And the Beijing in the north remains the northern capital run by the sort of political and military leaders of the North China Plain. And this is all sort of faded away as 1979, all that kind of stuff happened, but really starting to see what's going to be a big part of China's future with the stock exchange. So the problem with this whole method of taking capital from a region like the Yangtze region and injecting it into northern China is that it unbalances and destabilizes the entire regional economy. And even a better way to think about it is that this, by definition, that's what happens. So Chinese political processes, since forever, have always contorted the natural economic development of China, of the primary lowlands of East Asia, which are the Yellow River Basin and the Yangtze River Basin, sort of one on top of the other. And it's been artificial. The whole construct, the whole way China's ever organized itself into an economic and political unit has always been bizarrely and tortuously artificial. Any natural economic development process in the core regions of China would have meant a very, very weak state and almost continuous violence and probably all sorts of battles over what resources could be husbanded, and it'd be very difficult for anything to real stocks of capital to really accumulate in this region. That was what China's history was for a long time before it ever really came together as a real empire, a state. Well, empire in China really just means a state that can actually handle what all of China's problems really are. So this is something that Americans have no reference for. All the stuff I'm talking about now, Americans don't even know in general what any of this means. I mean, the American government, its involvement in the economy before the 1930s and 1940s was actually in the Qin and Han dynasties. And it actually continues to this day, as we're going to see. But what this means is there's never been any form of non-state directed development in China. The very brief moments sometimes people point to, really like the early Tang Dynasty, they're really not what they seem. And there's huge consequences to even attempting what happened during that period. But in general, you need this development. Again, you cannot forge northern China into something that is recognizable and legible and functional unless you get resources from elsewhere. So there's a whole story about that I get into elsewhere, but in general, we don't really need to know all that right now. We just got to know it's very different from the American experience, and maybe it's something worth talking about in another podcast or another video. But one way to think about it. Here's one quick way to think about it. Imagine, so the Great Depression was when all this started. The Great Depression in the United States, state involvement in the economy began with the Great Depression and then with World War II on a massive scale. So imagine back then, the Great Depression was really when the U.S. first did giant public works projects. It built the Hoover Dam. It built all sorts of things all across the country. Now imagine that after the 1930s, all those Hoover Dams, all those big infrastructure projects collapsed, and all sorts of disasters hit the country. And then bit by bit, the government had to claw back its authority and its capacity to rebuild all these great projects. And so it did eventually, who knows, decades, probably hundreds of years. It eventually did that. It rebuilt all the infrastructure. And then right afterwards, soon enough, it just gets knocked down again by further disasters. You do this for a few thousand years, and you can get a sense for why China believes and engages in state-driven development. This has been its history. It builds all these grand monuments. It did all these things to unify the country. The great infrastructure we see right now is the best example of it ever. And then, typically, inevitably, all this stuff crumbles. And you need a new round of integration to sort of reach a higher level or even the same baseline that you had before. And that's what happens. So this history is so different. In the United States, you have basically no need for major government investment for more than half of the U.S.'s history. In China, which is over or 20 times larger than the U.S., its history is 20 times larger, you've had something like this process for thousands of years. So it's very different. The psychology, the cultural patterns, the political norms and institutions, they're all totally different. But for right now, people just need to understand that this government-driven and controlled form of development, this is the normal state of affairs in China. This is the norm. Over 2,200 years, this has been going on. And what we saw, modern China's post-1979 opening up and reform period, as they call it, this corresponds with, it's one of the rare and short periods where economic activity is allowed to happen more freely than the norm would normally permit. Basically, these periods are short and sweet. This post-1979 period where you sort of let in all these new ideas, new products, new businesses, new foreign goods, new services, new foreign capital, foreign ideas, all these things. You allow them to enter the Chinese mainland. And when you do, they seriously destabilize the Chinese state, inevitably, every time. It's over a dozen times this has happened. And I mean, again, the Tang Dynasty is a great example because early on, the government, means nothing. This is basically the 600s and 700s AD. Further, but anyway, it doesn't matter. The early government during this time, Chinese government, it was very lax. It allowed all these things to come into the country. It allowed Buddhism. It allowed all sorts of things into the country. And all these dynamic forces for a while really supercharged growth and development. And then they contributed to cracking the state basically into pieces about 150 years after it formed, although it continued to lumber along as a corpse for another 150 years. And that's also something to keep in mind, that often the Chinese state, even though it's basically crumbling, the actual institutional imperial impulse in the country is so strong that the center can hold even when everything else seems like it's crumbling. So good thing to keep in mind. But this, again, the point being that 1979 to today seems like a very long time. China's been doing this forever. It's returning to a historical norm. No, it's actually doing the opposite. It is engaging one of its very brief periods of opening up, particularly opening up the ports, and then it inevitably closes. And only modern technology and globalization and China's hefty state capacity for all sorts of projects is keeping everything integrated and peaceful the last few decades. This is what enabled this very brief reform and opening up period to even exist at all. So now let's talk about North and South here. This is where the rubber really hits the road for Beijing. The government in Beijing is creating a Beijing Stock Exchange. And that is really, there's no better sign that life is reverting back to the historical norm than this. This is really a very sort of par for the course expected sort of move by the government, but it's also, it's so symbolic and so pregnant with these old historical patterns that it's really remarkable to see it actually happen. But basically, Beijing is already very overrepresented, the city of Beijing as the home base to major tech companies, because political connections and regulatory favors and access to state credit and capital in China are almost everything. And they're becoming more and more important as the sources of natural economic growth in the country have declined. So Beijing already does very well as a natural political capital. It's a very good place to be in the North China Plain for a couple of reasons, especially in the last 1,000 years. And it's a place where politically motivated finance can do very well. So, Tsinghua University and all of its spin-offs and everything going on there and all sorts of semiconductors and electronics firms, there's so much action in Beijing. It's actually pretty remarkable. There's not something like that, for example, in the United States. You don't have Washington, D.C. tech firms anywhere at all. You have like weird, bizarre analytics firms and data stuff, and they're crunching certain things, and they're connected to lobbyists and all this kind of stuff. But there's not this true, like, massive scale of technological innovation that you actually did see coming out of Beijing. So that's one thing, to be real political capital and to be able to dole out politically motivated financial, basically credit and goods. There's really something there, and there's people move to Beijing in China. A lot of entrepreneurs move to Beijing to be close to political authorities, regulatory authorities, and to give them better access to the state mechanisms that really help them drive their business and compete against competitors, both domestically and in foreign markets. However, Beijing is not and has never been a real financial capital, not once in the last 1,000 years, or when it was really important, and definitely not in the last 4,000 years. I have a whole podcast series on Hong Kong and how it developed. And I bring this up because Hong Kong is a financial capital. It was in the last couple hundred years for a couple of reasons. And in the third episode, I compare Shanghai and Hong Kong. And this is relevant right now because these are the two real financial capitals in China. And even between the two of them, there's no real contest. Shanghai is absolutely the big dog in this fight, and in a fair fight between these, again, financial capitals, relatively domestic in China. Not that exists. There is no fair fight in this sort of thing in a state-driven context like China. In any fight, Shanghai wins. Any fight for Chinese domestic capital, Hong Kong just gets squashed like a bug. There's no way it wins at all. The reason why Hong Kong exists and developed the way it did, I go into this in this series, but basically it's because it's a borderland. It was situated on the very edge of China, and it was the best place to basically sit and interface between China and the rest of the world, and that was enormously valuable, particularly since 1979. It corresponded with the growth of everything else in China. So anyone interested in some of why financial capitals appear where they do should check that out. It's really focused on the Chinese context, and there's a lot more to be said on that, but it's probably good for another video. But we'll just briefly talk about why Beijing itself sucks as a financial capital and has never been one. The way it works is, Beijing is not a natural center for trade capital, so all sorts of trade goods don't move through that region, through that area, or through that city. And it's not a natural center for agricultural capital either. There's no real farm goods that pass through there. There's no it's not an intermediary point for storage or transportation or for various tools or anything, or even for any sort of middleman activity in agriculture at all. Beijing's not a natural center for natural resources like mining capital or for industrial manufacturing capital. And so basically what I'm trying to say is that there's a couple ways that you can become a financial node in some way. And often there's an underlying base of assets or stocks and flows that that particular region is actually very naturally attuned to. Typically trade, New York being a great example, agriculture. One people could think of Chicago, places like St. Louis, certain natural resources like mining, and then industrial capital. So if you're getting capital from agriculture, from trade goods moving through your region like port cities, for natural resources, a lot of South America, certain cities in South America fit that bill, and then obviously industrial manufacturing. If you're a region where all sorts of inputs are brought together to create manufactured goods, that's another way that you can sort of develop the capital base that you often then need finance to sort of move that capital around, move the flows around, interface between various parties, exchange them, do all that sort of stuff. And then even more so, you end up as a more major financial capital if you're doing that more than just domestically. So you're both a domestic financial capital for something. Typically, the most common one is trade. That's the most obvious one. But often the best are for all of them, which is, those are the really great ones. And that's kind of how it works. So Beijing is not a major port. It's not on a major river. It's not on the coast. It's not a major distribution point for food products or for raw or processed minerals or metals or goods. This is a place that has no place. This is a place that has no place being any sort of financial capital. None of the knowledge, skills, labor, firms, or intangible products that would develop to facilitate moving all of this capital around ever developed in Beijing. What Beijing does have is the full weight of the Chinese government behind it, which is what is really trying to force this stock exchange into being. And again, in China, the state capacity is so strong. The regulatory heft and the regulatory hammer is so powerful that this is the sort of city that actually thinks it can muscle itself into being a financial capital, even though it doesn't have any of the natural attributes that would allow it to do so. And that's actually a bit of a commentary on where Beijing is going and where China writ large is going. But the massive, massive state apparatus developed and centered entirely in Beijing literally thinks it can do basically anything at this point. It can become anything and create anything. And there is a sense where they created all these cities, they created all this infrastructure, they created almost everything. And in China, in modern China, it really does empower this sense. But the question of limits and what's really possible really seems to be something that the government is losing track of. And well, we're going to see this is part of the reason this Beijing stock exchange is not going to work. At least it's not going to work in any way that people in the West would think of it working. It may work for certain local Chinese internal problems, like we'll talk about. But yeah, we'll get to that in a bit. Let's first talk about why Beijing even wants this stock exchange. So we talked about the classic sort of North versus South issue, the fact that Beijing doesn't usually have its own resources and kind of needs to get it from other regions, and kind of what makes you a sort of potential financial capital candidate. And all these things don't really push in a good direction for what Beijing's up to. So let's actually try and nail down a kind of deeper level what is actually going on. So what it's trying to do is Beijing is trying to create a totally political equity exchange. And this means it is basically giving up entirely on organic growth in China. And people have been seeing and saying that this is happening since basically 2008. But now we really see it in action. And this is a move that is all about control. It is about tightly controlling capital and placing it closer to regulators and closer to party officials. This is a clear sign that all the conjoined twins of financial problems like massive debt and financial innovations like decentralized finance and data-driven lending are all scaring the CCP. So the Chinese Communist Party, the problem of financial innovation and the challenge of having financial problems growing in China at the same time as financial innovations are growing is really difficult to manage. And really is basically just scaring the Chinese government. The problem with Ant Financial with all the decentralized finance, with the knocking down Bitcoin and all of the various basically blockchain technologies that could impact finance, all of this has been done to limit the scope of financial services that are beyond the reach of the government. And it is totally based on stability and trying to focus and create incentivize the creation of a financial sector that the government can actually manage, because all of these things, the whole decentralized finance thing in particular, pushes against government control. And that is terrifying. And what Beijing is doing is asserting that, no, we're going in the other direction entirely. So you knock out blockchain technologies out of China, at least non-state controlled blockchain technologies outside of China, and you start moving even the basic financial infrastructures even closer to Beijing. I mean, this is also a sign not only of the fact that you're focusing on stability and control and controlling capital, but it's also a really important signal that Beijing is reconsolidating around Beijing. I mean, it feels like it has less control, obviously, over the Pearl River Delta with all the problems in Hong Kong. And then clearly this is a sign that what's going on in Shanghai is also raising some eyebrows. And so China is basically trying to manage everything in its country. You know, this whole finance re-regulation, total regulation. It's very similar to what you see with energy and agriculture and all these other major systems in the country. And it's trying to manage everything when it is the most unmanageable it's ever been, right? All of these systems are bigger than ever. The massive amount of capital, domestic capital in China, and credit just sloshing and flushing all over the country is insane. And the party's it's powerful, but it's only 95 million people. And trying to wrangle every aspect of the insanely complex machine that China's built is a really dicey proposition. You know, life was actually much easier in China when you could just rely on more organic growth, catch-up growth with the rest of the developed world, and impose a sort of investment and credit-dependent model on everything from the top down. But now the investment and credit-dependent model doesn't work. The organic growth is gone, and you're still forced to impose something from the top down, but it's very unclear what you actually have to do. And so what the moves that China's making, whether it's in entertainment or technology or finance or energy or anything, they're all saying that, hey, what we can actually do is try and secure the very basic, most core region in China, which is this North China Plain, and basically ensure that at least the military and political and administrative apparatus there can be preserved, which is basically what every Chinese state ever does based on where their capitals are, which is typically Beijing for the last 1,000 years. And yeah, I mean, that's actually relatively doable compared to trying to do another massive national rejuvenation, which when China's already nationally rejuvenated itself. That's kind of the joke with Xi Jinping's whole goal of national rejuvenation. It's like, well, you did that to the extent you could. You've kind of blown your load. And well, the truth is the party knows this. Trying to perfectly dole out capital to everyone who needs it from a central command center, which is part of what this Beijing Stock Exchange is about. Hey, now everyone, you come to Beijing, get what you want, that kind of thing. That's what I was looking at. I mean, this is never going to work. And, this is yet another desperate gamble by the government. And it's not some wise judgment from the all-seeing and all-knowing leaders in Beijing. That is this kind of trope that really needs to go because it doesn't fit what we see at all. So let's get deeper into why this won't work, this Beijing Stock Exchange, why it won't work, and more importantly, why it will cause serious problems. First of all, we need to kind of step back a bit and say, what is the purpose of a stock exchange? What is the Shanghai Stock Exchange actually doing? And is there some way in which a competitor in Beijing would do it better? Would it encourage better outcomes or results in Shanghai? Would it do anything to somehow improve things through competition domestically or with other financial capitals around the world? Like, could a Beijing Stock Exchange help either Hong Kong or Shanghai or Beijing compete against New York, for example? Well, there's a lot of ways to talk about this, but one thing that comes to mind is, well, Just imagine that the U.S. government suddenly decided that it wanted to create a Washington, D.C. stock exchange. What would Americans think if that was what you heard coming out of D.C.? And especially when the first pool of companies that were going to go on the exchange is chosen by a bunch of federal regulators. Yeah, I mean, what this is it's just a feeding frenzy for corruption. That's corruption not based on Xi Jinping's definition, but corruption based on the rest of the world's definition. The truth is that the Shanghai Stock Exchange, which is the core one, like I mentioned earlier, it beats out all the others. And this is really where any sort of new financial market and at all in China would always be compared, contrasted, and related to what's going on in Shanghai. And the Shanghai Stock Exchange is fundamentally flawed right now and probably for the foreseeable future because, I mean, basically, it's filled with really poor macro data. There's all sorts of false financial statements floating around. There's inscrutable corporate governance. There's hidden and suppressed interest rates. I mean, there's unpredictable and ever-changing rules. There's political vendettas and insider activity. And I mean, it's a casino. It's frequently compared to a casino, a sort of gambling operation. And that's not totally off because basically, if China wanted a real global financial center, which Shanghai technically, it's one of the places on earth that is really well set up to be a global financial center. Well, to reach something like global status. It is at the mouth of the Yangtze River, so it has all sorts of agricultural capital and trade capital and all in goods capital now, all flowing through it from everywhere, all around the world. It's a major node in the world, so it really does work out in a way that Beijing doesn't. But as I mentioned earlier, the reason you have all these problems is because northern China, Beijing, the political authorities are always trying to manage the wealth in Shanghai, the natural wealth and capital that it could accumulate. And so you have all these problems because if China really wanted a global financial center, a real one, it would need to suck it up and fix its capital controls and all these basic mechanisms and problems that I just mentioned. And it doesn't want to do that. It doesn't want to do that, and it's trying to give Shanghai a very limited, really, like based on its actual policy, it's trying to give Shanghai a much more limited financial role than people around the world seem to think. Everyone seems to think, oh, they're trying to make it to a global financial capital. No, they're not. They don't want that. There's no reason all that would do is further destabilize these internal dynamics within China. And tinkering with the stock exchange is also a bad move. I mean, in 2015, changes in the little volatility in the Shanghai Stock Exchange really almost led to a total blow-up. And after then, Beijing has really abandoned the idea of Shanghai ever being a real global financial capital. And with the Beijing Stock Exchange is basically admitting that it's even trying to undermine its role within China. It's the idea that a place like Shanghai, which could be a major financial capital, I mean, is going to be forced to compete with something locally. I mean, this is ridiculous. This is like saying, oh, if we opened up a DC stock exchange, that it would somehow ever compete with New York. I mean, it's absurd on its face. But we aren't really prepared to look at what's really going on in China. We don't have the sense of the internal dynamics enough to kind of really see where things are going. But again, this is a major sign of weakness. I mean, would a DC stock exchange be a competitive threat to any country anywhere else on Earth? Would it boost U.S. growth or dynamism or anything? Of course not. It would be an entirely internal process and a bizarre one. But kind of familiar when you think about the sorts of entrenched political invested interests that could take over certain parts of government. And that's kind of what you would see. But all this is going to do, all the Beijing Stock Exchange is going to do is further distort economic patterns in China. I mean, I mentioned earlier that economic activity in China is always distorted. That's kind of the basic thing you have to do because you basically have power in the north and wealth in Shanghai, the Yangtze, and the southern ports. And unifying wealth and power is extraordinarily difficult. It's basically impossible. That's what Chinese history says. This is basically impossible. And what you do get is basically the North muscling everybody else. And there was a brief period, I think 1979 to let's just say 2020, when all of this kind of worked. There was enough growth, there was enough organic growth, there was enough investment and credit sort of development processes to spread growth around as much as possible, even if it didn't really work, the actual infrastructure or whatever. There was a time when it could function. That time has definitely passed. And some listeners might think this is just more of the same, that messing around with this or that. The Chinese government's always messing around with everything, and who cares? It's just another thing. And it's kind of true, but financial flows are really some of the most prickly and dangerous things a government could mess with. Basic financial infrastructure touches everything, and the consequences of tinkering around with it can be really severe. So, a lot of people have a lot of both hate and mistrust of finance, especially after the 2008 crisis and the fact that everything just seems to continue on. But part of the reason things continue on is because making big changes, there's not sort of rocking the boat whenever people are really confronted with how massive and seemingly dysfunctional and bizarre and dark arts sort of finance, like how dark artsy and sorcery driven finance really seems when you look at it at its core. Most policymakers are always like, well, maybe we'll just kind of leave it as it is. And there's all sorts of problems with that. It leads to 2008. It leads to all sorts of things. But really messing with it all the time is also very dangerous. And so that's why a lot of finance guys are always concerned with interest rates and where things are going and who's saying this and who's saying that, because these little motions, they can lead to butterfly effects where people start doing this and doing that, and it can go crazy. Just the reason this whole episode exists is because financial flows, talking about financial flows and what they do. It's really creating a new exchange and trying to reorient some of the basic patterns of financial activity in China. I don't think it's ever going to get to that point with this exchange, but that's what it's intending. That's a really big move, and it's a real sign of how deep this impulse is to shift from growth to control. So very important to keep in mind, and there can be so much collateral damage from this sort of stuff, but China's kind of far beyond that, so it might not matter at all, but it's really worth considering. And what China really wants is basically just greater control over its financial system. That's the core of what this is. It has nothing to do with almost anything else. And also calling this future exchange in Beijing a stock exchange is probably a misnomer, because it would not function like a typical equity market in the West. At this point, it's going to be so totally politically driven. It's going to be trying to pull in tech companies from the South and financial stuff from Shanghai. It's going to be extremely bizarre, and it's not going to. It's going to be a very peculiar institution, kind of geared towards addressing some of the deteriorating economic conditions in China in a very Chinese way, while maintaining the sort of institutional forms people are familiar with in the West, at least on the surface. So it'll be called a stock exchange. It'll be doing things. It'll be moving money and buying shares and purchasing and moving things around. But what's actually going on could be very, 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 very different. And just an example, quick point on this. A key point to remember is that one of the distinguishing features of China's version of industrialization was the fact that it relied on totally centralized state banks. So the chaebol and the keiretsu that spearheaded development in Shanghai, in South Korea and Japan, these were these big conglomerates. They were large. The industrialization in those two countries was driven by large private conglomerates centered around their own private banks. So at the center of a Fuji or Sumitomo or whichever organization, or Samsung, whichever one you want to choose, there was always a private bank at the center that coordinated the whole constellation of different organizations that these business groups were involved in. That's never how things worked in China. The state always held the purse and doled out the funds. It's a very different model. And again, it gets back to this need for the North to have, in the Beijing, the political authorities in China, to have control over capital flows and economic activity as much as possible in the country. It's very, 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 very dangerous for everyone in China if it doesn't. And Well, this is about to become even more true as fears rise and political controls expand, and the purse starts to shrink. Just the money available is getting tighter, and in China, everything else because of that, everything else is going to get tighter too. So, yeah, I guess we'll leave it at that, and that's basically all for today. I hope this video helped explain a bit about how, why, and where financial centers form. Kind of got into that a bit. The different processes countries use to manage and grow capital. It's really not just a natural organic process all the time. In the US, we have a bias towards that because it really does fit a lot of US history. A good percentage of it, more than in most other places. But that's not how it works all over the world. And so the way the finance actually functions in the real economy can be very different in different places. It doesn't mean there's some things that are better or worse, but there are very different sort of priorities that can move countries in different directions just based on the sort of their own needs and constraints and priorities. So that context should have helped to explain a bit more about what is really going on in China and China's new Beijing Stock Exchange. I mean, this is not about creating competition for Shanghai or any other major financial center. It's not even about improving Chinese economic efficiency or overall Chinese economic growth. It's about fear and control, and it's a desperate attempt to make things easier for regulators in Beijing. The inevitable outcome of this policy is to make lending and access to credit even more political in China than it already is. And as this move further distorts incentives and decision-making and capital allocation in China, another consequence will be increased tensions between the political authorities in Beijing and the more dynamic and entrepreneurial regions in southern China that are also less politically connected by definition. And that is a very old and dangerous pattern for the country to be experiencing or to be contemplating, really. But that's where things are going. And this all really, to make matters worse, this really all goes hand in hand with the government crackdown on tech companies. Basically, this government is sending a major signal about who runs China and who determines where the country is heading. And it is definitely not innovative companies and entrepreneurs that want to move the country into the future. And those aren't the people at the helm here. It is the Chinese state, and that's something that's going to further compromise tech financing and innovation and experimentation in the Chinese economy, and particularly in its innovative tech sector. There's no other way that this goes. Unless, of course, if you're on the government's good side, you get all sorts of capital, but you also get the government's investment priorities. They're going to be imposed more explicitly or implicitly on a lot of organizations, and there's sometimes good that comes from that. If you're engaged in catch-up growth with the rest of the world, and you know exactly what you need to build and what the rest of the world has that you don't, well, maybe your priorities are better. If some random entrepreneur in southern China wants to develop some bizarre product when you don't even have electricity or fuel or cars, maybe you can actually tell them what to do, and you might do a little better at trying to build the basic infrastructure that the country needs. That's very true. But now, it's very different. China's in a very different place, and the government doesn't know everything. It can't know everything, and it has to manage so many things that it's going to stretch itself. It's going to rip itself to pieces trying to do all of this, trying to manage all of this across every sector. And economically, there really couldn't be a worse time for China to try and stifle its most dynamic sector. But I guess China's already so beyond the pale in terms of its capital structure and everything else that maybe it just doesn't even matter. So if you're the Chinese state, you just try and hold on to everything. You just got to do what you got to do. That's kind of what we're being told with all these moves and with the creation of a Beijing Stock Exchange of all places. All right, well, see you next time.